Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. We're continuing our discussion of World War II, and in previous lectures covered the war in Europe and the ultimate victory in Europe, VE Day. And in the lectures that follow, we're going to turn our attention to the Pacific. And in this first lecture, we'll talk about the war in the Pacific after the initial tragic defeat at Pearl Harbor. While Pearl Harbor was a stunning blow against the American Navy in the Pacific, it was hardly the only defeat at that time in the Pacific. The Japanese launched simultaneous attacks against almost every American and Allied outpost in the Western Pacific. It wasn't only Pearl Harbor that was attacked, but also Guam, Wake Island, the Gilbert Islands, Hong Kong, the Philippines, the Aleutian Islands, and many others. By the end of April 1942, the Americans were hard-pressed to hold on to the Philippines. With the devastation of the American Navy at Pearl Harbor, there was no way to get reinforcements to the troops who were still holding out in the Philippines. Ultimately, they split apart and fought almost to the last man, one-on-one combat over this stretch. Think about this, 4 or 5 months fighting on their own without reinforcements. Many Americans died in the Philippines and many others were captured. The bulk of those captured were forced to endure what has come to be called the Bataan Death March, where they were forced to march 70 or 80 miles before eventually being sent to the prison camps where they would spend the duration of the war. The march was brutal, and they were treated horribly by their Japanese captors, given very little, if any, food or water along the way. And of course, they're already malnourished and hungry after holding out for so many months. If they fell by the wayside, they were simply shot along the side of the road. About 80,000 Americans and Filipinos were taken prisoner over the course of this process. About 10,000 Filipinos were killed, along with about 650 Americans. This was essentially America's introduction to the war in the Pacific. It was an incredibly harsh and brutal war, and mistreatment like this contributed to powerful anti-Japanese sentiment among the soldiers and among Americans in general. We talked about some of this when we discussed the internment of Japanese Americans on the home front. But certainly this bitter hatred extended to the battlefront as well. And while there is certainly intense animosity in both Europe and in the Pacific theaters, there's an intensity of the hatred against the Japanese that exceeds what we saw against the Germans in Europe. After the initial attack at Pearl Harbor and the devastation to the American Navy, the United States essentially went into a defensive pattern in the Pacific for a time, looking for any signs of hope and holding out until they could resupply and reinforce the Navy. One of these signs of hope was the Doolittle Raid, which was an attack launched on April 18, 1942. This attack was led by James Doolittle, or Jimmy Doolittle, whom we've mentioned briefly in this course once before. He was one of the leading stunt and aerial race pilots of the pre-World War II era. This goes back to the 1920s. In this attack, 16 B-25 medium bombers were launched without fighter escort across the Pacific to attack Tokyo. The bombing raid had little material damage, killing about 50 people and doing slight damage within the city. 15 of the 16 aircraft reached China, and the 16th landed in the Soviet Union. 77 of the 80 crew members survived the initial attack. More than the material damage that was done, the impact of the Doolittle raid was more psychological on both sides. For the United States, it provided a major confidence boost and showed that we were still capable of launching attacks and that we were not completely on our heels. On the Japanese side, similarly, it struck some doubt into the minds of Japanese leaders and encouraged the idea that they further needed to attack and further devastate the American Navy before they could achieve victory. The Americans received a further confidence boost from the Battle of the Coral Sea from May 4th through 8th, 1942. In this battle, American and Australian forces repelled a Japanese attack against Australia. This was one of the first pure carrier battles in the history of warfare, as both the American and Australian side and the Japanese side waged this battle exclusively from aircraft carriers. In material terms, the Japanese probably did more damage in this battle, critically damaging and ultimately sinking one of America's carriers, the Lexington. And as I've mentioned, the American Pacific Fleet was already depleted. But two Japanese carriers were also damaged, and ultimately they were not able to participate in the Battle of Midway, which occurred the following month and was a much more decisive battle. And so it was the Battle of Midway in early June of 1942 that proved to be the turning point in the Pacific campaign. The Americans understood that the Japanese were preparing a massive attack somewhere, but again, they weren't entirely certain whether it might come in the Aleutian Islands or the Philippines or somewhere else. And so they actually took advantage of the intelligence advantage and knowing they had broken Japanese codes. And they were thinking the attack might come at Midway Island, and so American intelligence officials sent out messages suggesting that Midway Island was running low on fresh water, that their desalination equipment had broken. And sure enough, a message came back through Japanese intelligence, coded of course, but that their selected target was running low on fresh water. And so the Allies knew the attack was going to come at Midway Island. And so they positioned American carriers and what was left of the Pacific Fleet to defend Midway Island. And over the course of this 3-day battle, they launched several successful counterattacks against Japanese carriers, sinking several of them. And of course, the Japanese were not expecting a massive counterattack. Several Japanese carriers were sunk and the invasion was repulsed. So this was the first major significant victory for the Americans in the Pacific, struck a genuinely significant blow against the Japanese Navy, who began to retreat back towards Japan in the aftermath of that battle. The process that followed the Battle of Midway has sometimes been called island hopping by historians. And while it's not an inaccurate description, it does perhaps suggest that the process was much easier than it actually was. These were not merely men or forces hopping across the Pacific Ocean. The Japanese were thoroughly dug in and defended the many small, harsh, craggy, volcanic islands of the South and West Pacific. And in fact, this was some of the most harsh fighting of the entire war, as the Japanese really had no concept of surrender, and thus they fought to the last man in these very difficult conditions. The American Navy, as is suggested by this map, divided up into two components, making progress across the Western Pacific on a southerly track, which involved some of the larger islands in the South Pacific, and a more northerly track as well, attacking many of the smaller islands. We will talk in a little bit more detail about this process of making progress towards Japan itself in the next lecture.